Take off my brother's medal right now. You don't deserve to wear this uniform after driving my brother to that terrible tragedy. My sister-in-law's glass of red wine splashed directly onto me, staining my proud, pristine white Navy ceremonial uniform a brilliant crimson. A few steps away stood my parents-in-law, the tycoons of the Brown Defense Weapons Empire, arms crossed, smirking in amusement. They gleefully enabled this humiliation, completely indifferent to my shattered heart, as the agony of losing the man I loved most was dragged out and trampled in front of a crowd. The entire gala hall held its breath. Hundreds of eyes from the elite class locked onto me, waiting for the pathetic collapse of a mad widow. But they were wrong. I didn't shed a single tear. Slowly wiping the streak of wine off my rank insignia, I stared straight into that arrogant family with a chilling composure and softly delivered my command. Thanks for the wine. It just helped me make a decision. To permanently suspend your $800 million mega contract. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, where you are. As the dark red wine dripped from my crisp white lapel and splattered onto the polished marble floor, the heavy fermented smell of alcohol hit my senses. In a fraction of a second, the luxurious ballroom vanished from my peripheral vision. I wasn't at a gala anymore. I was standing in the freezing, sterile air of the military morgue months ago, staring down at the crimson-soaked flight suit of my husband. The same shade of red. The same sickening warmth spreading across fabric that was supposed to stay clean. They had pulled him from the wreckage of a jet that should never have been cleared for flight, and the Navy coroner had folded his hands over his chest like he was sleeping. But the burns on his neck told the real story. Following his horrific death, my mother-in-law had weaponized her fake theatrical tears for the cameras, dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, while reporters captured her devastated performance for the evening news. My father-in-law had aggressively leveraged his political connections to close the investigation as pilot error, burying the real cause under 3 layers of classified red tape, and $250,000 in legal fees. For months, I had swallowed their condescending insults, playing the role of the broken, submissive widow, while secretly auditing their defense contracts from the shadows of naval intelligence. This wine splash was the final confirmation of their absolute, untouchable arrogance. They believed they had already won. I felt the familiar, dangerous spike of adrenaline flood my bloodstream, but I instantly engaged my tactical breathing. I inhaled sharply for 4 seconds, held it, and forced the agonizing memories back down into a locked vault in my mind. The morgue disappeared, the ballroom returned, and I had a mission to execute. I did not break eye contact with my sister-in-law. I didn't raise my voice or offer her the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. I simply turned my back on her smug theatrical posture and began a flawless, measured march toward the center podium. The agonizing heat of the stage spotlights hit the damp, clinging stain on my chest, turning the wine into a glowing badge of defiance. Every pair of eyes in that room followed me. As I moved, the hundreds of hushed whispers among the defense contractors, 4-star generals, and elite politicians abruptly died down into a suffocating silence. The only sound in the massive hall was the sharp, rhythmic click of my leather heels striking the marble floor. Each step landed like a countdown. I could feel my father-in-law's smirk beginning to falter in my peripheral vision, the first crack appearing in his decades-old armor of arrogance. I reached the heavy wooden lectern, gripped the edges to ground myself, and felt the cold, solid grain of the wood beneath my fingers. I reached up and adjusted the microphone with one remarkably steady hand. I bypassed the staring crowd entirely and locked my cold, observing eyes directly onto my father-in-law, Richard, who was standing by the towering crystal champagne fountain, his arrogant smirk still plastered firmly on his face. He had no idea what was about to happen. None of them did. I reached into my tailored jacket, pulled out the heavy leather-bound contract file, and slammed it onto the wooden surface of the lectern with a deafening thud that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The crystal chandeliers above trembled. I was supposed to sign the authorization for the $800 million project today, but the incident just now has highlighted a severe security risk, I announced. My voice was entirely devoid of grief or hesitation. It echoed like a rifle crack over the state-of-the-art PA system. Every defense contractor in that room stopped breathing. I watched two four-star generals exchange a sharp, panicked glance near the exit. I leaned closer into the microphone, my gaze piercing straight through my father-in-law's rapidly crumbling facade. I let the silence hang for a torturous second, letting the weight of what I was about to say settle over the room like a burial shroud. If the leadership of Brown Defense treats the honor of a Navy officer and the sacrifice of your own flesh and blood as a joke, how can the military place the lives of thousands of soldiers in your hands? The color drained from the faces of their corporate investors. Two board members from Brown Defense were already reaching for their phones under the table, their fingers trembling as they punched out frantic messages to their damage control teams. My father-in-law's champagne flute slipped half an inch in his grip, the golden liquid sloshing against the rim. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic, panicked murmur. The arrogant smirk on my father-in-law's face vanished instantly, replaced by a sickly, pale gray mask of sheer terror. He looked like a man watching his own empire collapse in real time, and he was absolutely right. My mother-in-law grabbed his arm, her diamond bracelets clinking as she stuttered incoherently at the disaster unfolding before her, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his $10,000 suit. My sister-in-law, the one who had thrown the wine, stood frozen with her empty glass still raised in midair, her mouth hanging open. I didn't give them a single second to formulate a defense or call for a recess. I delivered the final execution-style command with brutal finality. As the project director, I officially declare, suspend all disbursements and initiate a comprehensive quality investigation into Brown Defense. I will not let a single national dollar fall into the hands of those who disregard the blood and bones of our soldiers. I didn't wait for a response. I picked up my officer's cover, turned sharply on my heel, and marched off the stage with perfect military bearing, leaving their billion-dollar empire spiraling into absolute uncontrollable chaos behind me. The clicking of my heels was the only sound that followed me out. No one dared to stop me. Later that night, I sat inside the soundproofed, tension-filled cabin of my armored Navy command vehicle. The heavy steel doors completely blocked out the screaming paparazzi who were already swarming outside the military gates like vultures, their camera flashes popping in the darkness like distant gunfire. The harsh blue light from the tactical intelligence monitors cast long, exhausted shadows across the grim faces of my staff. The cabin smelled of diesel fuel, burnt coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of overheated electronics. The civilian news networks were already burning with the radioactive fallout from the gala. My sister-in-law, leveraging her massive unrestricted PR budget, was viciously spinning the narrative in real time. She had quickly paid off primetime commentators to claim that the wine incident was entirely provoked by my own erratic, hostile behavior. She was flawlessly framing my suspension of the mega contract, not as an act of military integrity, but as the unhinged emotional outburst of a grieving woman who was rapidly losing her grip on reality. 3 separate networks ran the same manufactured headline within the same hour. The coordination was surgical, expensive, and unmistakable. My subordinate David thrust a military-grade encrypted tablet toward me. He was practically vibrating with suppressed anger, his knuckles white as he gripped the device, the veins in his forearms standing out like cables. "Colonel, the articles are trying to paint you as a mad widow." He reported, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. I took the tablet and scanned the glaring headlines. Each one used my husband's name as a prop, leveraging his death as evidence of my supposed instability. Every time I saw his name reduced to a cheap media tool, a sharp physical pain spiked deep in my chest, right behind my sternum, as if someone was pressing a hot needle into the bone. But an intelligence officer cannot afford to operate on rage. I shoved the tablet away, fixing David with a freezing, unwavering glare that demanded absolute discipline. "Keep a cool head, David. Use all internal Navy media channels to stabilize the situation. Do not respond to baseless provocations," I ordered. We could not afford to fight a media war on their terms. They had the money, the connections, and the civilian infrastructure. We had the truth, and the truth needed to be deployed at the right moment, not wasted in a shouting match with paid liars. The heavy, suffocating silence in the command vehicle was suddenly shattered by the sharp mechanical vibration of my high-security encrypted phone. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. This wasn't a standard line. This was a black site communication channel that fewer than 12 people in the entire Navy even knew existed. A top-tier encrypted message successfully bypassed our military firewalls and flashed brightly on the screen, the green text glowing in the dim blue cabin. My heart skipped a violent beat as I read the heavy, impossible words. Colonel Parker, I am Martha Jenkins. I worked as a logistics assistant for the Brown Group for 25 years. I have the death files, all the evidence of that family's filthy deals. It is time they pay the price. I read the message 3 times to ensure I wasn't hallucinating from exhaustion. A 25-year insider from the core of my father-in-law's empire was offering me the keys to his destruction. David leaned over, read the message, and his face went completely white. He grabbed the edge of the console to steady himself, then slowly sat back down in his seat. He looked at me and said nothing. He didn't need to. In 15 years of military intelligence operations, I had learned that the most dangerous weapons are not missiles or bullets. They are people who have been silent for too long, who have finally reached the point where their fear of staying quiet surpasses their fear of speaking up. Martha Jenkins was that weapon, and she had just armed herself and walked through our front door. We both understood that this single message had just changed the entire trajectory of the war. Martha Jenkins. The name echoed in my memory like the toll of a heavy bell. I remembered my husband speaking of her years ago with a rare, quiet respect, sitting at our kitchen table rolling a coffee mug between his calloused pilot's hands. He had called her the only honest person in his father's building. She was the invisible ghost in my father-in-law's towering corporate empire, the woman who poured the coffee, filed the logistics reports, and saw absolutely everything while saying nothing for a quarter of a century. She was the ultimate blind spot of an arrogant billionaire who believed that loyalty could be purchased indefinitely with a modest salary and a parking spot. I looked up at David, my posture going totally rigid as I shifted my entire operational stance from defensive survival to aggressive offense. I issued the command rapidly, my voice devoid of hesitation. Establish a secure communications line immediately. Schedule a secret meeting with Martha Jenkins for early tomorrow morning. The real war is just beginning. At 8 the next morning, I stood inside the freezing, echoing expanse of an abandoned industrial warehouse on the grim outskirts of the city. Rusted beams crisscrossed the ceiling 40 feet above, and the massive steel loading doors were shut tight, filtering only a few harsh beams of morning light through the cracked skylights. The concrete floor was covered in a fine layer of industrial dust, and the air tasted like iron and old grease. My secret ally. Martha stood waiting in the center of the room. She was 65, her hair heavily silvered and pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun. She wore a faded trench coat that hung loosely on her thin frame, and she possessed the sharp, exhausted eyes of someone who had witnessed decades of unimaginable corporate rot. There were deep lines carved into her face, each one a year of silence. Without offering a single wasted pleasantry or handshake, she hoisted 2 massive dented metal briefcases onto a rusted table. The table groaned under the weight. She rapidly spun the complex combination locks, the loud mechanical clicks echoing off the bare concrete walls, like a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate. Martha flipped the heavy lids of the cases open, immediately revealing thick stacks of yellowing ledgers, encrypted hard drives, and manila folders stamped with red, top-secret warnings. The dry, dusty smell of old paper filled the cold air between us. For 25 years, I was always the one cleaning up Richard Brown's garbage, Martha said. Her voice trembled with a volatile mix of bitter disgust and sheer, overwhelming relief, as if the words had been rotting inside her chest for decades, and she was finally coughing them out. Corruption, tax evasion, bribing defense officials, and, worst of all, covering up severe technical flaws in the weapons. He always believed I was just a mindless, loyal puppet. She paused and pressed her lips together, her jaw tightening with the effort of keeping her composure. Martha pulled a faded photograph from her breast pocket and laid it flat on the table between us. It was a picture of a young man barely 20 in a brand-new Navy flight suit, grinning at the camera with the reckless joy of someone who believed the sky was his birthright. My husband. Taken on his first day of flight school years before I had ever met him. He used to bring me coffee on Saturdays when he visited his father's office, Martha said quietly, tracing the edge of the photograph with one cracked fingernail. He was the only person in that entire building who ever called me by my first name. Everyone else called me the assistant. Your husband called me Martha. My throat constricted so violently I couldn't speak. The boy in that photograph had no idea that his own father would sign the paperwork that killed him. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm until the pain gave me something to focus on, something other than the unbearable image of my husband as a boy bringing coffee to the one decent person in his father's kingdom of filth. I ran my fingers over the edges of the ledgers. Each page was a landmine. The sheer magnitude of my father-in-law's treason was crystallizing before my eyes, documenting decades of blood money traded for American lives. Bank statements from offshore accounts in the Caymans, photographs of handshakes with foreign arms dealers in hotel lobbies, internal memos ordering the destruction of failed quality reports. My hand suddenly froze over a dark crimson folder nestled at the bottom of the second case. It was labeled in stark black ink Operation Black Arrow, the designation of my husband's final fatal flight. My fingers went numb. The warehouse seemed to contract around me, the walls pressing inward. Martha's voice cracked in the cold air, losing its steady edge for the first time. "Colonel, that is the real reason I decided to step forward. Liam was a good man. He didn't deserve to die like that." Her eyes glistened and she turned her face away for a moment, her weathered hands gripping the edge of the rusted table. I ripped the file open with shaking hands. The original unredacted engineering report stared back at me in clinical black and white. 14 separate fatal short-circuit warnings, each one flagged in red by the lead engineer, each one personally overridden by my father-in-law's initials. He had explicitly ignored the warnings to protect his profit margins and his production timeline. He had knowingly sent his own son into the sky in a flying coffin, then paid millions to bribe crash investigators into labeling it pilot error. My husband's blood was the cost of a quarterly earnings report. The concrete warehouse spun violently around me. My father-in-law wasn't just a corrupt, greedy tycoon. He was a literal murderer who watered his money tree with his own son's blood, and my mother-in-law had helped him hide the shovel. Every condescending remark she had ever made to me, every time she had looked down at my working-class background, with that thin, practiced smile she had been standing on a grave she helped dig. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted hot copper, refusing to shed a single tear of weakness over this horrific evidence. Tears were a luxury. Tears were what they expected. I reached across the rusted table and gripped Martha's calloused hands with bone-crushing force, anchoring myself to reality. The old woman didn't flinch. She squeezed back with a strength that surprised me, the strength of someone who had carried this burden alone for 25 years. "Mrs. Jenkins," I whispered, my voice dropping into a lethal absolute vow that carried no mercy, no negotiation, no possibility of retreat. "I am going to butcher this cold-blooded empire to pieces. We are going to make them pay with their lives." Martha held my gaze and nodded once slowly. The pact was sealed in that freezing warehouse between a widow and a ghost over the bones of a dead soldier. By the afternoon, the retaliation from my father-in-law was swift, calculated, and utterly ruthless. Utilizing his deep, untraceable political pockets, he didn't just attack me in the tabloid press. He filed a formal high-level complaint directly to the Navy General's Board at the Pentagon. His team of corporate lawyers officially accused me of a gross abuse of military power, formally claiming that my sudden suspension of the contract was a deranged personal vendetta that actively threatened national security. The accusation was designed to trigger an immediate internal investigation, one that would strip my clearance and bury my evidence before anyone outside the Navy ever saw it. Simultaneously, outside my private residence, my sister-in-law's paid media mob descended like a plague of locusts. Dozens of aggressive news vans completely blocked my driveway, their blinding camera flashes violently illuminating my darkened living room through the narrow slits of my heavy curtains. The muffled, overlapping shouts of reporters demanding a statement vibrated through the walls, a constant suffocating pressure that turned my own home into a fishbowl. They had my address. They had my unlisted phone number. My sister-in-law had purchased every advantage money could buy and deployed it all in a single coordinated strike. I stood perfectly still in the center of my living room, my hands clasped behind my back, the atmosphere suffocating as the media circus raged outside. The heavy oak door swung open and my legal shield, Major Elena Rostova, marched into the room. She slapped a thick, intimidating stack of legal briefs onto my glass coffee table, the impact cracking through the silence like a gunshot. Her usually stoic, unreadable face was pale with tension. Her military uniform slightly wrinkled from hours of frantic legal maneuvering, her collar uneven on one side, which for Elena was the equivalent of coming apart at the seams. Colonel General Jonathan Hayes, chairman of the review board, is under massive pressure from Brown's political faction. Elena reported rapidly, not bothering to sit down. She was pacing, which she never did. They are trying to orchestrate a closed-door hearing to suspend you before we can release anything. The words hit me like a precision-guided missile. Elena pulled a single sheet from the stack and held it up. It was a formal suspension order pre-drafted with General Hayes's signature already inked at the bottom. The date was left blank. They had prepared this before the ink on my father-in-law's complaint was even dry, which meant Hayes had been in their pocket long before tonight. Elena's voice dropped to a near whisper as she delivered the worst of it. The hearing was scheduled for the day after tomorrow behind closed doors with no media access, no public record, and a hand-picked panel of 3 officers who had received campaign donations from Brown defense PACs in the last election cycle. They were trying to silence me before I could fire a single shot, bury the entire Operation Black Arrow file in a classified hearing that would never see daylight. My father-in-law had learned nothing from the gala except that I was dangerous, and his response was to use the very institution I had sworn to serve as a weapon against me. The walls of my own home were closing in on me. They wanted to strip my rank in a dark, quiet room where my evidence would be buried forever, just like they had buried my husband's safety reports under layers of bribes and bureaucratic silence. I looked at the chaotic shadows of the reporters shifting aggressively outside my windows, their silhouettes distorted and monstrous against the thin curtains. They were an army, not my army. They were mercenaries on my father-in-law's payroll, every single one of them, and they wanted me terrified. They wanted me to surrender and accept my role as the disgraced hysterical widow who cracked under the pressure and quietly disappeared into a military hospital somewhere. I straightened my uniform jacket, rolling my shoulders back into a rigid, uncompromising posture of command. The muscles in my jaw tightened until I could feel my teeth grinding. I turned my icy gaze back to Elena, refusing to let even an ounce of panic or despair enter my voice or my demeanor. Prepare all necessary legal briefs to protect my standing as an officer. Buy me time. I ordered, delivering the words with absolute mechanical precision, sounding more like a battlefield commander than a woman under siege. We are not going to fight on their home turf. We are dragging this war into the light. I wasn't going to wait to be slaughtered behind closed doors while corrupt politicians decided my fate. Elena's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, and then she understood. She scooped up the legal briefs, stuffed them back into her leather attaché case, and marched toward the door without another word. I turned my back on the legal briefs and walked toward the front door, my hand resting heavily on the cold brass knob. The transition from defense to offense had to happen right now, right through the absolute teeth of their rabid media beast. I was going to tear their narrative apart on live television, and I was going to do it in the next 60 minutes before General Hayes could convene his puppet tribunal. I pulled the front door open, stepping directly into the blinding, chaotic barrage of camera flashes and screaming paparazzi. The heat and noise slammed into me like a wall. Reporters shoved microphones violently toward my face, hurling insults and invasive questions about my mental stability, my husband's death, my fitness for command. I ignored them completely. I marched through the hostile, pushing crowd with cold, unflinching military discipline, my eyes locked dead ahead. My hands at my sides, every step measured and deliberate. 2 of them stumbled out of my path. I stepped into my waiting armored vehicle and the heavy door sealed shut, cutting the noise to a dull roar. Minutes later, I was sitting in the freezing, heavily air-conditioned studio of the National Broadcasting Network. The leather makeup chair was cold against my back. Opposite me sat my media crucible, Victoria Vance, the most ruthless and respected military investigative journalist in the country. Her silver hair was cut sharp, her eyes were pale and predatory, and she had destroyed careers with a single follow-up question. The heavy studio makeup felt like war paint on my skin, thick and foreign. The glaring red on-air bulb of the main camera clicked on with a soft electric hum. We were broadcasting live to millions of viewers. Victoria leaned forward across the glass desk, her sharp, predatory eyes boring into me, instantly going for the jugular without any polite introductory remarks. Colonel Parker, the Brown family is accusing you of using military power for personal revenge. Public opinion says you are losing control due to the pain of losing your husband. How do you respond to this? She demanded, her tone laced with skepticism. It was the exact highly engineered narrative my sister-in-law had paid millions of dollars to construct across social media. Every word of that question had been designed in a PR war room. I didn't flinch. I didn't cross my arms defensively. I didn't shift in my seat. I stared directly down the dark barrel of the camera lens, utterly refusing to play the fragile, broken victim they desperately needed me to be. I let the silence stretch for 2 full seconds, long enough for every viewer at home to lean forward in their chair. I could see my own reflection in the dark glass of the camera lens, a woman in a wine-stained uniform sitting perfectly still while the world waited for her to crumble. Behind Victoria, the production crew had frozen in place. The floor director had lowered his cue cards. The teleprompter operator had stopped scrolling. Everyone in that studio knew they were witnessing something that would be replayed for years. Victoria, when an officer puts on this uniform, they swore an oath to protect the nation, not to protect the profit margins of contractors. I stated clearly. My voice was chillingly calm, instantly dropping the temperature in the studio and commanding absolute authority. What the Brown family calls personal revenge is actually the panic of parasites accustomed to draining budgets by providing substandard equipment. Victoria's eyes widened slightly at the sheer unapologetic brutality of my counterattack. The studio crew behind the cameras exchanged stunned glances. I had just called the most powerful defense family in the country parasites on live national television, and I had done it with the composure of a woman ordering breakfast. Victoria immediately leaned closer, seizing the explosive moment, her journalist instincts overriding any pre-show agreements she may have had with the Brown PR team. "Are you accusing Brown Defense of fraud?" she asked, practically breathless, her pen frozen above her notepad. I leaned in, weaponizing every single syllable to destroy my in-laws' credibility permanently. I am reminding the public of the honor of this uniform. We live in an era where defense tycoons hide behind the word family to manipulate power, using money to smear honest soldiers who dare to stand in their way. I didn't whine about my grief. I didn't mention my husband's name as a plea for sympathy. I commanded the truth on behalf of every soldier bleeding on the battlefield, every veteran who had trusted equipment manufactured by contractors who cared more about stock prices than survival rates. By the time the intense 30-minute broadcast ended, the live social media sentiment feeds scrolling on the studio monitors had entirely flipped. The Mad Widow label was dead buried under an avalanche of public outrage directed squarely at the Brown family. My face was no longer the face of a grieving woman. It was the face of an unyielding commander seeking absolute justice, and millions of Americans were watching me wage war. If you've ever had to stand alone and fight back against powerful people who tried to destroy your truth, please take a second to like this video. And tell me in the comments, how did you find the strength to speak up when everyone else wanted you silenced? Realizing the TV interview had completely obliterated their media advantage, my father-in-law resorted to the most cowardly, below-the-belt tactics imaginable. He utilized his shadow financial leverage to temporarily freeze the Navy's development budgets, trying to incite a mutiny among my military subcontractors by cutting off their funding and blaming me for it. 3 of my project leads received anonymous threatening phone calls within the same hour. But the true unforgivable gut punch came later that day. Unable to find a single flaw in my decorated military record, his expensive private investigators dug 30 years deep into my past. They found a tiny, expired financial debt my mother had incurred when she was working 3 jobs and literally starving to put me through school. They plastered her exhausted 70-year-old face across the tabloids, framing me as a desperate, manipulative gold digger who only married into the Brown family for their immense wealth. The headline read, "Like mother, like daughter, a family of grifters." They used a photo of my mother from a public records database, her eyes hollow from years of overnight shifts. Her face aged beyond her years by poverty and sacrifice. The woman who had sold her wedding ring to pay for my textbooks was now a tabloid punchline. I found out because David showed me the article on his phone. My mother had seen it first. She had called the base switchboard 4 times trying to reach me, and each time my father-in-law's hired reporters had intercepted the public line and recorded her confused, frightened voice asking for her daughter. They played those recordings on a podcast mocking her accent, mocking the way she mispronounced my official title. She was 70 years old. She had survived a factory collapse, a foreclosure, and the death of my father from lung disease when I was 11. She had never once asked me to fight her battles. And now these people, these obscenely wealthy parasites, who had never worked a single honest day in their pampered lives, were using her as a human shield. The rage that swelled in my chest felt like I was swallowing ground glass. They were terrorizing a fragile elderly woman just to break my spirit. A woman who had never asked me for a single dollar, who had refused every offer I had made to move her into a better home, who had wept with pride the day I received my commission. I slammed my fist onto my steel command desk, the violent impact rattling the computer monitors and sending a pen rolling off the edge. I turned to my legal shield, my eyes blazing with a dangerous, unrestrained fury. Major Elena, get a court order immediately to protect my mother from the harassment of those detectives and reporters. At all costs, I commanded, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the violent tremor shaking my hands. My mother had nothing to do with this war. She was a civilian. She was collateral damage in the truest, most sickening sense of the word. I would gladly burn the entire city to ashes before I ever let those corporate vultures touch a single hair on my mother's head. Once the military police confirmed my mother was safely secured in a protected safe house, I completely compartmentalized the blistering fury, channeling it directly into cold, calculating focus. That night, my headquarters transformed into a frantic Black Ops intelligence hub. David, Elena, Martha, and I stayed awake for grueling hours, fueled by nothing but cold coffee and the bitter taste of unfinished business. The rapid mechanical clacking of keyboards filled the room like automatic gunfire. Martha sat in the corner, methodically organizing decades of financial records with the precision of a woman who had been cataloging sins for a quarter century. Elena drafted legal filings with a speed that blurred the line between human and machine. Working the phones at 2 a.m, we established contact with Rachel Adams, a former Navy veteran who had been brutally scapegoated by my father-in-law for a previous equipment failure 6 years earlier. Her career had been destroyed, her pension stripped, her reputation shredded by the same machine that was now grinding against me. She agreed to testify. Her voice on the phone was hoarse and raw, the voice of a woman who had spent 6 years screaming into a void. She told me that my father-in-law had personally called her commanding officer the night before her tribunal and dictated the exact wording of the charges against her. She had the phone records to prove it. She had kept them in a fireproof safe in her basement, waiting for the day someone would finally believe her. Her damning testimony added a second barrel to our growing arsenal, and the phone records added a third. The scattered pieces of the ultimate indictment clicked together perfectly on our massive digital war board. The screen glowed in the dark room, a web of connections, names, dates, and dollar amounts that told the story of a criminal empire masquerading as a patriotic defense company. I drank my fourth cup of bitter, freezing cold coffee, my eyes burning with exhaustion as I stared at the high-resolution scans of my father-in-law's digitized signatures on the suppressed safety reports. Every signature was a confession. Every overridden warning was a death sentence he had signed without blinking. My in-laws had thrown every dirty, unethical punch they possessed in their arsenal. They had attacked my career, my sanity, and my mother. But they couldn't stop the meticulous, unforgiving advance of an intelligence officer preparing for the final kill shot. The trap was set. The evidence was encrypted, backed up on 3 separate secure servers, and ready for transmission. All I had to do was pull the trigger on the dawn of the 5th day. At exactly midnight, just as our encrypted files were ready for transmission to the FBI, a devastating digital bomb went off. My sister-in-law leaked a blurry, terrifyingly realistic security video to the tabloid press. It showed a woman wearing my exact Navy uniform with my exact face and posture, violently grabbing Olivia by the collar in a dark, flickering hallway. In the footage, I appeared completely unhinged, brutally pushing her against a concrete wall and screaming vile, abusive threats that echoed down the corridor. The video quality was intentionally degraded, just grainy enough to look authentic, just clear enough to make the identification unmistakable. Within minutes, it went viral globally. Every news notification on every phone in the country buzzed at the same time. Instantly, Olivia appeared on the late-night talk show hosted by Thomas Sterling, sobbing hysterically without producing a single real tear. She flawlessly played the traumatized innocent victim of her militant, abusive sister-in-law, clutching a tissue she never actually used, her voice cracking at rehearsed intervals. She claimed she lived in constant terror of my violent outbursts, that I had threatened her life repeatedly, that she had been hiding the abuse for months out of fear. The sheer speed and coordination of the release proved it was a highly expensive, premeditated strike. The video, the talk show, booking, the social media amplification, all of it launched within the same 20-minute window. Thomas Sterling, the talk show host, fed Olivia scripted questions with the rehearsed timing of a man who had received his talking points hours in advance. He held her hand on camera. He called her brave. He turned to the audience and asked if America was really going to let a violent military officer terrorize an innocent woman. The studio audience, half of them planted by Olivia's PR team, erupted in choreographed outrage. Within 30 minutes, a petition calling for my immediate arrest had gathered 200,000 signatures. This was not a reaction. This was an assassination, and it had been planned long before the gala, waiting in reserve for the exact moment I became too dangerous to ignore. It was a lethal military-grade deepfake, but the civilian public didn't know that, and they didn't care. They saw what they were shown, and what they were shown was a decorated Navy officer violently assaulting a crying woman. My hard-earned integrity, built over 2 decades of honorable service, was shredded into confetti in seconds. The comment sections erupted with calls for my arrest, my court-martial, my dishonorable discharge. Within an hour, an extremist mob incited to violence by the fabricated video, and Olivia's crocodile tears breached my property line. They shattered my reinforced living room windows with heavy bricks wrapped in printed screenshots from the deepfake video. They spray-painted vile slurs over my pristine front door in dripping red paint that looked like blood in the porch light. The sound of shattering glass was followed by the dull thud of rocks landing on my hardwood floor, scattering shards across the hallway where my husband's boots used to sit. Inside the military command network, the fallout was instantaneous and unforgiving. General Hayes, seizing the political opportunity provided by the video, immediately summoned an emergency tribunal for the next morning. His orders were clear. Officially suspend me, strip my top-secret security clearance, confiscate my weapon, and prepare a court-martial for conduct unbecoming of an officer. In the eyes of the world, I was already convicted. The trial was just a formality they were eager to complete. Besieged in my own home with the mob threatening to breach the front doors, my security detail dragged me down the narrow stairs into the underground panic room. The heavy blast-proof steel door locked shut with a sickening final thud that vibrated through my bones and up into my teeth. The air inside the cramped bunker was frigid, smelling sharply of rust and recycled oxygen. The walls were bare concrete lined with emergency supply crates and banks of flickering security monitors. I stood frozen, staring at the grid of security feeds on the wall, watching the violent mob ransack my manicured lawn, ripping up flower beds, overturning the mailbox. The muffled sounds of destruction vibrated heavily through the ceiling above each impact, sending a fine shower of dust drifting down from the concrete. An unbearable, suffocating wave of sheer helplessness crashed over me, crushing the air out of my lungs. They had billions of dollars. They could buy reality itself. They could manufacture evidence from thin air, purchase expert witnesses, and hire entire newsrooms to repeat their lies until the lies became the accepted truth. They could rewrite history, and in that moment, standing alone in that freezing bunker, I was completely powerless to stop the machine. My husband's framed photograph sat on the steel emergency shelf placed there months ago when I first prepared this room. His face stared back at me through the dusty glass, that half-smile he wore in every photo, the one that said he knew something you didn't. He was wearing his flight suit in the picture, standing on the tarmac at dawn, the sun behind him painting the sky in shades of amber. He had sent me that photo the morning of his last flight with a one-line message, "Going up, save me some dinner." I never got to make that dinner. The casserole dish I had prepared sat in the refrigerator for 3 days before a neighbor threw it away, while I was at the hospital, sedated and unable to speak. My legs gave out. I slid down the rough, jagged concrete wall, pulling the framed photo of my husband tightly against my chest. The cold glass pressed against my collarbone. For the first time in this entire grueling war, the steel armor fractured. I wept in the suffocating darkness, the sobs tearing violently from my throat, like something physical was being ripped out of me. The sound bounced off the concrete walls and came back to me, distorted, animal, unrecognizable. I pressed my face into my sleeve and cried for my husband, for the life we were supposed to have, for the children we had planned, for the quiet retirement on the coast that existed now only in a dead man's promise. But I refused to let it become a pit of despair. The agonizing injustice of being stripped of my final chance to avenge my husband, of watching his murderers walk free while I rotted in a bunker, morphed instantly into a blinding white-hot rage that burned away the tears like water hitting a furnace. I wiped my face violently with the back of my sleeve, smearing the dirt and salt across my skin. I grabbed the edge of the steel tactical desk, my knuckles turning white, and pulled myself back up to my feet. My spine straightened, my jaw locked. I placed my husband's photo carefully back on the shelf, face forward, watching over me. I wasn't going to die in the dark like a victim. I was going to hunt them down. At dawn, the underground panic room felt like a pressurized tomb, utterly silent, except for the low electrical hum of the servers. The fluorescent lights above cast a sterile, unforgiving glow over everything, erasing all shadows. Soft, deliberate footsteps approached my desk. My secret ally Martha handed me a steaming cup of pitch-black coffee. The ceramic was hot enough to sting my palms. "Colonel, drink some of this. A soldier cannot fight if she lets herself starve," she ordered gently, her steady, exhausted eyes transferring an invisible, ancient strength into me. She had been awake all night, too. The lines on her face seemed deeper in the harsh light, but her hands were perfectly steady. I looked at the coffee, then at my husband's photo on the shelf. My husband didn't quit when his jet instruments failed him in the sky. He fought until the very last second of impact. The cockpit voice recorder proved it, his voice steady and professional, calling out readings and corrections right up to the moment the engines died. He had died working, not screaming. I had absolutely no right to quit now. I drank the scalding coffee in 2 long gulps, letting the bitter heat shock my nervous system back online. The fog in my head burned away. My vision sharpened. My hands stopped trembling. I aggressively booted up the high-resolution security mainframe and downloaded the viral deepfake video directly to the local encrypted drive. The download bar crawled across the screen. I stopped grieving and started analyzing the footage with the cold, mechanical detachment of a battlefield topographical map. I became the intelligence officer again, the one who had spent 15 years decoding satellite imagery and intercepting encrypted enemy communications. I scrubbed the timeline back and forth, frame by excruciating frame, zooming in on individual clusters of pixels, relentlessly searching the heavy shadows for a flaw in the digital rendering. I checked the lighting angles against the corridor dimensions. I measured the gravity of the clothing against the movement speed. I analyzed the audio waveform, looking for compression artifacts that would indicate synthetic generation. The footage was good, expensive, professional. But no fabrication is perfect, and no liar accounts for everything. At exactly 14 seconds into the footage, right as the simulated version of me shoved Olivia, my exhausted eyes locked onto a tiny, glaring discrepancy that sent an electric shock through my entire body. I leaned forward until my nose was nearly touching the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs as I rapidly adjusted the contrast dials. "Wait," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper in the concrete tomb. "Look at the reflection on the metal frame of the cleaning cart." Martha came up behind me, squinting at the screen. In the main frame of the video, my hands were violently choking my sister-in-law against the wall. The rendering was flawless. Every shadow on my uniform perfectly placed, every wrinkle in the fabric consistent with the movement. But on the curved chrome surface of the janitorial cart sitting beside us in the hallway, the reflection showed an entirely empty corridor. No people, no violent assault, nothing but blank space and fluorescent lights bouncing off a clean linoleum floor. The rendering team had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the primary image and forgot to paint the reflections on a $2 cleaning cart. I pulled up the original building blueprints from the Navy's facility database and cross-referenced the hallway dimensions with the camera angle in the video. The shadows fell at an angle consistent with overhead fluorescent fixtures positioned 8 feet apart, but the blueprints showed the fixtures in that corridor were spaced at 12 feet. They had built the entire digital environment from a stock model, not from the actual building. Every single frame was a provable forgery. In their desperate, arrogant rush to destroy my reputation before dawn, the high-paid tech mercenaries had forgotten to manually render the background reflections on curved surfaces. It was a rookie mistake born from the same fatal arrogance that ran in the Brown family blood. They always underestimated the details because they believed money could overpower precision. My mind snapped into lethal, absolute clarity. The exhaustion evaporated. The grief locked itself away. I was operational again, fully and completely running on nothing but black coffee and 20 years of military discipline. I grabbed the encrypted phone off the desk, dialing my tech sniper without looking at the keys, my fingers finding the numbers from muscle memory. Alan, I just sent you a data file. Look for traces of AI algorithms and asynchronous lighting. I need hard proof of this forgery within 2 hours. Alan's voice came back sharp and immediate. He was already awake. He had been waiting for my call. I slammed the phone down and turned to David, who was sitting across the room with dark circles carved under his eyes, his uniform wrinkled from sleeping in a chair. David, transmit the Operation Black Arrow files directly to the FBI director and request a synchronized raid, I ordered. My voice echoed off the concrete walls like a judge's gavel striking wood. Cancel all defensive protocols. Ignore General Hayes's hearing. Notify all major media channels. Set up a nationwide military press conference at command headquarters immediately. It's time to end this game. David stared at me for exactly 1 second. Then he was on his feet, moving faster than I had ever seen him move, punching numbers into 3 different phones simultaneously. Martha stood in the corner, her arms folded, and for the first time since I had met her, the old woman smiled. Later that morning, the command headquarters auditorium was packed to the doors, with hundreds of ravenous journalists, frantic defense contractors, and furious military brass demanding answers. The noise was deafening, a wall of overlapping voices and clicking cameras that made the room feel like a living organism. Under the blinding halogen lights of the press pool, I stepped up to the main wooden podium, my white uniform utterly flawless, bearing my medals of service, each one polished to a mirror finish. I had ironed the uniform myself at 4 in the morning. I had shined my shoes until I could see my face in them. Every detail was a weapon. The chaotic room fell into a dead, anticipating silence the moment I touched the microphone, the way a courtroom goes quiet when the judge enters. I looked out over the sea of camera lenses, projecting my voice with unwavering, chilling authority. You have all seen a video, and now I will show you the truth. My tech sniper Alan operated the massive digital screen behind me, stripping away the deepfake rendering layers in real time, exposing the empty hallway reflection to the entire world. The screen showed the original frame, then the reflection, then the algorithmic fingerprints of the AI generation software, all laid out in clinical, undeniable detail. The auditorium gasped in collective, horrified shock. Hundreds of journalists simultaneously began typing on their laptops, the sound like a sudden rainstorm. But I wasn't done. The deepfake was just the appetizer. Fabricating evidence is merely a crude cover for a far more barbaric crime. I declared, my voice vibrating with righteous, suppressed fury. I signaled the technician, and the screen flashed violently with the original suppressed safety reports, bearing my father-in-law's undeniable digitized signature, right next to the massive offshore bribery bank statements. 14 overridden safety warnings, 3 offshore accounts, 12 years of falsified quality reports. The entire rotting foundation of the Brown defense empire exposed under stadium lighting for the entire nation to see. Brown defense is not just corrupt. They betrayed their soldiers. Richard Brown knew his weapons were flawed, yet he still let his own son, Lieutenant Colonel Liam Brown, fly that murder machine. And then, he used his money to cover up the death of his own flesh and blood. The horrifying silence that followed my words lasted exactly 3 seconds before it shattered into a deafening, uncontrollable uproar. Journalists leaped to their feet, shouting questions over each other. Camera operators pushed forward, knocking over equipment in the rush. Simultaneously, the side monitors switched to live helicopter feeds, showing the FBI kicking down the glass doors of Brown Defense headquarters. Agents in tactical gear stormed through the lobby, their boots crunching over the shattered glass of the company's own front entrance. My father-in-law was slammed face first into the marble floor of his office, handcuffed, while frantically trying to shred documents that were already backed up on 3 federal servers. My mother-in-law was escorted out in restraints. her designer scarf twisted around her neck, her mascara running in black streaks down her face as she screamed at the agents that they were making a terrible mistake. My sister-in-law was pulled from her car in the parking garage, her phone still in her hand, mid-text to her PR team, the message half-finished and never sent. Federal agents seized 17 servers, 400 boxes of financial records, and a private vault containing $3 million in cash, bundled in vacuum-sealed plastic. The Brown family's personal accountant was arrested at the airport with a one-way ticket to a country with no extradition treaty. He didn't make it past the gate. Their billion-dollar empire was dead. The Brown name was no longer a dynasty. It was a criminal indictment, and every television in the country was broadcasting its funeral in real time. In the immediate aftermath, utilizing the frozen defense funds, I established the Martha Jenkins Military Integrity Institute to fiercely protect future whistleblowers from corporate retaliation. The institute bore the name of the woman who had waited 25 years for someone brave enough to listen, and it ensured that no one would ever have to wait that long again. Rachel Adams was hired as the Institute's first director of veteran advocacy, her stripped pension fully restored by congressional order. Martha stood beside me at the dedication ceremony, her silvered hair catching the light, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. When the ribbon was cut, she reached over and squeezed my hand once, the same bone-crushing grip from that freezing warehouse, and I squeezed back. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The building behind us, a converted defense office that my father-in-law had once used to sign fraudulent contracts, now bore her name in gold letters above the entrance. The brutal saga ended weeks later in the grand, quiet expanse of the Navy Hall of Honor. Under the massive oil-painted portrait of my husband, I stood tall as the highest Medal of Honor was pinned heavily to my chest by the Admiral. The gold surface caught the blinding flashbulb, sending tiny fragments of light scattering across the dark wood paneling of the hall. I could feel the weight of the metal pulling gently against my uniform, the same uniform that had been stained with wine at that gala, the same fabric that had absorbed my tears in the panic room, the same cloth that had stood behind the podium while an empire burned. I reached up and touched the cold metal with my fingertips. The Admiral saluted me. The entire hall of officers rose to their feet and saluted in unison, the sound of 200 hands snapping to their foreheads echoing off the marble walls. I held the salute and looked up at my husband's portrait. The painter had captured his eyes perfectly, that quiet, knowing confidence of a man who understood exactly what the uniform meant. My mother sat in the front row, wearing a new dress she had bought for the occasion, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes red, but her chin held high. She had refused a wheelchair despite the long walk from the parking lot. She was a soldier's mother, and soldiers' mothers do not sit down when the nation is standing. The war was over. Our honor remained untouched. The monsters were locked in cages. And somewhere in whatever place soldiers go when their mission is finally complete, I knew my husband was standing at attention, proud of the woman he married, proud of the fight she had fought in his name. Sometimes true justice means tearing down the empire of those who hurt you to protect the legacy of those you loved. If my journey brought you any peace, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments below, who is the person that gives you the strength to keep fighting your hardest battles?